You're listening to the Transform Your Life from the Inside Out podcast. This episode is titled, What Are Your Best Addictions? Now, the reality is that all of us have addictions. I mean, they're brain-based. We all have addictions. But the question for you is, and we'll dig into it in the episode, what are your best addictions? Keep listening. Okay, addictions. When we hear that, we hear that word addictions, or when you think about, as I just said, what are your best addictions? When you hear that, most of us think, and I did for many years, that, addictions are a very, very bad thing, and I do not want addictions. Because, we grow up that way. We hear about people, we're kids, Uncle Bob, and he's addicted to alcohol, and Aunt Susan is addicted to gambling, and, all these things that people think they're addicted to. And we'll talk about it a little bit in this episode, but the reality is that your brain must create habits. It's a survival mechanism. And then these habits become, for many of us, addictions. And the reality is, look at your life, look at the world around you, that many of these addictions don't serve you. They don't serve us. I've been there before, and I know, I've not had, for example, addiction to heroin or something like that. But there are things that I've been addicted to. And it can be everything from surfing the internet. It can be porn for some people. It can be alcohol. It can be gambling. And I want to talk about addictions of emotions in just a moment, because I really want to tie that to what are your best addictions. But you're full of addictions, and like I said, most of us think they're negative, but the reality is it's that we need to choose. It's vital that we choose addictions that actually support us and build us. Now, earlier in the episodes, I think it's probably episode 3, 4, 5, I talk about habits. If you're new to the podcast, I tell everyone, go back to the very beginning and start there, because everything kind of builds on itself over time. And what a lot of us do is when we listen to podcasts or different things, we only want the most recent episodes. And the truth is, if you do that, you're going to get great content and value. But you're really going to miss out if you don't go back to the beginning. But one of the earlier episodes is about, habits and how the brain forms habits and what habits are and what they're not and all these kind of things. So I'm not going to really go into it in this episode. Go back and listen to that one. But I got online a little bit earlier, and I just found this one little passage here that basically, let me just read it to you. And it says, neuroscientists have traced our habit-making behaviors to a part of the brain called the basal ganglia, which also plays a key role in the development of emotions, memories, and pattern recognition. Decisions, meanwhile, are made in a different part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. Now, that being said, I talk about that in many different audios here, different episodes, podcast, is that the prefrontal cortex is the thinking part of your brain. It's the part of your brain that's thinking right now about what you're hearing. But habits come from a different part of the brain. They come from the reptilian part of the brain, which we'll get to in just a minute, the oldest part of the brain. Something that I want to accentuate here, and I talk about in my habit program, and I'm sure I mentioned it in the podcast here, is that your brain, the reptilian part of the brain, the basal ganglia, operates from the premise that all habits that you have are survival mechanisms. Think about that for a moment. Address that. Is that all patterns that you have in your life, they're self-serving behavioral patterns because they're survival patterns, even though we analytically might not think they're survival patterns. So let that soak in for a moment before I move on, because when we listen to podcasts or different things, we hear something and we're like, oh, that's good. Boom, we're off to the next thought again, and we're not even paying attention to what we just, learned a couple of minutes ago. So we have to work from that place that every habit you have is a survival mechanism, habit-based mechanism of some sort. And you could say, well, Jim, that's just not true because, for example, how is smoking something that kills you? How is that a survival mechanism? Well, that's your prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of your brain that says, no, that's bad. You know, they say on TV that's bad and all the ads and research, it's bad. But the reptilian part of the brain, all that it knows, it doesn't know good or bad. All that the reptilian part of the brain knows is habits, which are things that we do with repetition over and over and over again. And the reptilian part of the brain, it cannot analyze. That is the job of the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain. And the reptilian part of the brain, the basal ganglia, it doesn't analyze. It simply is literally, this matter and these synaptic responses in the brain and everything else, and the biological brain, but that part of the brain doesn't reason and doesn't analyze. And this is not just me making something up. I mean, go research it for yourself, and you'll discover that it's true. So, what happens is the reptilian part of our brain creates habits that we deem as bad habits, but yet they become habits. And then what happens is many of us fight our habits and then wonder why we can't break our habits. Anyway, go back and listen to the earlier episode on that. I think episode number 5 or so, when I talk about habits, and I'll go into more detail there. I do tell people that we put our habits into a few categories that we call addictions. And we put them into either chemical addictions, behavioral addictions, or mental addictions. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit later on in this episode, is your mental addictions. So when you talk about chemical addictions, we're talking about alcohol, and we're talking about drugs, and things that literally, I'm careful how I say this, these things also cause chemical reactions in the brain. So what happens, I'm not going to go into it here because it's pretty long. It take a while to explain it, is that when you create these synaptic responses in the brain and your neurons fire in the brain, what happens is these things fire around things like drug or chemicals in the brain, which affect the brain, which heighten the addiction. And then we have behavioral addictions. And behavioral addictions would be things like nail biting, gambling, partially because it can be physical and, behavioral, and psychological, is sex. For example, this is why people become addicted to things like pornography. And then we have mental addictions. And mental addictions are repetitive thoughts over and over and over. Mental addictions are basically your habits of thinking. And all of these things, as I was just saying, I mean, it would take forever to come in and sort all this out. All these things become chemical as well, because things that you think affect the endocrine system, and they affect, the body and the communication of cells in the body. So we can have mental addictions, which can also become physical addictions. But again, let's keep this really simple. And I want to talk about mental addictions in a minute, and mental addictions that keep you trapped. So I think I have already laid the foundation that we're all addicted. Everyone is addicted. But the next thing is what are you addicted to? Okay, so mental addictions. And these are things that a lot of people don't recognize as addictions. They recognize they have the behavior and the thoughts and the feelings associated, but they don't recognize it as addictions. And they can be things, for example, are you a big-time worrier? So addictions can be worry, anger, fear, shame, greed. There are people that are addicted to hate, for crying out loud. There are different psychological addictions. And I think the 3 biggest addictions that I see in people would be worry, unhappiness, and anger. I often mention my brother-in-law, Don Javier, the shaman. And somebody, now I call him Don Javier, but somebody messaged me last week on Instagram and said, does he have a Facebook page or something? No, he's a real shaman. Shamans are literally not anywhere in the masses. And a real shaman, that is. I mean, you would never find a shaman, for example, the Amazon, who's a shaman coming up and saying, you know, I want to move to New York because I want to create an Instagram following. Or no, it doesn't happen that way. There's some guy on YouTube that calls himself Don Javier. I've never looked. I don't know who it is. Has nothing to do with me. But I want to point out that's not the Don Javier that I'm talking about. It's my brother-in-law. His name is Javier. Don is a sign of respect. So he's called Don Javier as a shaman, a sorcerer, a babalao on the wall. I was on family vacation with him one time. An extended family, was there, and somebody was on that trip who tended to be angry very often. And this is probably because he stays up late. Don Javier doesn't even really start talking, air quote, meaning imparting wisdom and guidance and all this kind of stuff till really the wee hours of the morning. I mean, it's very usual for me to be with him, as I was last night, until, 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, starting from the night before. But he was sitting talking to somebody, and she was getting in her anger about certain things and the way people were being and her expectations and all of this. And he said to her, he goes, you are in your anger, and you get in your anger a lot. And she said, and I like her. I mean, I've always liked her. She said in a very sweet voice, no, I'm not angry. And even in her tone of voice, there was not a self-denial, but a lack of self-realization and an ability to see herself. And that many of us would experience her as angry quite often. But if you ask her, are you an angry person? She would say, no, I'm not an angry person at all. And what Don Javier said to her is that, yes, you are angry, and you're angry quite often, but yet the anger has become a habit for you. And because it's become a habit, you get into your anger, number one, not knowing that you're doing it, and secondly, not even recognizing when you are in anger because you're in the habit of being in anger. So think about that. So that goes back to you again. What things, because my intention is to give you some guidance to pull you out of these things with this episode. What things do you get into in terms of thoughts that are self-destructive patterns? And mainly, let's go back to worry and unhappiness and anger. And let's add one more, fear. So look at that for a moment. And do you spend your life in fear? Do you spend your life worrying? Do you spend your life in unhappiness? Do you spend your life in anger? One caveat, and there's kind of a loop here that I really don't want to take a lot of time going into this episode. I do want to separate here that some people can be unhappy because they have, let's say, for example, what would be, called clinical depression, which is a chemical imbalance to some degree in the brain or chemicals in the brain. But what I also want to point out is that so people will say, well, I can't be happy because I have, I'm clinically depressed. I'm on medication and the psychologist said so. I get that. I understand that. Yes, it is real. What I want to point out is I also understand it firsthand experience. After college, I had what would be diagnosed most likely as clinical depression coupled with panic and anxiety attacks. Oh boy, you want to talk about a mess. I mean, I was literally between And I never really contemplated suicide. I mean, I would be too chicken to do that. And it's not why I came to the planet, to leave the planet on my own volition in that kind of way. But I can't say that I really enjoyed living life at all. It was that bad. And my days were humdrum, and I would drag through my days. And then on top of that, I had panic attacks on top of that. And I had anxiety attacks on top of that. And then I would have anxiety attacks about having panic attacks. I mean, it was a meltdown. I wasn't a hot mess. I mean, I was a volcano. That hot, and when it comes to a hot mess. And this was 1988. I lived on the beach on South Padre Island, Texas, which is pretty much where I grew up, South Texas, near Mexico. I managed a t-shirt shop, and I really didn't have a lot of money. I didn't make that much. And I was trapped in life because I had no money to get out of the cycle that I was in at that point, because I didn't know all the things that I'm sharing with you on this podcast. And it took me about a year to get out of that air quote depression. Now, what I'm sharing with you is I had it bad. I mean, I really had bad depression. Now, I tell you that because some of you might be experiencing that. And I didn't have drugs. I didn't have a psychologist. I didn't have a psychiatrist. I didn't go to a doctor because I couldn't afford it and I didn't have health insurance. And I came out of the depression in maybe 8, 9, 10 months, maybe a year. I don't remember. And what I've recognized in my maturing and in my age over the years is that this is going to be controversial to some people. But when we're experiencing something like that, and we can say, well, Jim, it's chemical reaction in the brain, there is something creating that subconsciously. Think about that. There's something creating that subconsciously. And when we come to explore ourselves and know ourselves, which is where I'm going in this episode, when we come to explore ourselves and know ourselves, that's when we have power and influence over things that happen like addictions, which we don't know how to air quote control or stop. And they go on for many people for years. Okay, so in shifting the gears, I want to postulate something to you, a new way to think about something. And I want to share this phrase that Don Javier said to me many years ago. And that phrase is that human beings are the highest technology on the planet. Consider that. You are the highest technology on the planet. Now, my more analytical listeners will run and they will look up the definition of technology, and they will say, oh, Jim, technology is, the application of some scientific so-and-so to an outcome or whatever. And I understand that because we tend to think of technology in terms of artificial intelligence and robots and computer, all these things in the hospitals. And that's what we think of as technology. But what if you thought of yourself as technology? And let me share something here. Think about this for a moment. Consider this. Do you know how to make your hair grow? Consider that. Let me give you a good one here. Let's say that you have a really salty meal and you're hungry, you eat the meal, but do you know how to separate? I mean, consciously, could you put down pen and paper and tell me how to separate the salt out of that food in your system so that you don't overload your system with too much salt or whatever? What about, distilling alcohol or drinking alcohol? Your body, your liver knows how to distill alcohol when you consume it. The question is do you, meaning you listening right now analytically, do you know how to make your hair grow? Do you know how to make your heart pump blood? Do you know how to breathe? Do you know how to distill the chemicals in your food when you eat it and then send it where it needs to go in the body? All these things that I mentioned. Well, guess what? There's a part of your brain that can do this, okay? There's a part of your brain that does this, directed also by, now this is going to be a little, for some people, but your higher mind. I mean, you have innate intelligence running through you. That's why, for example, you can plant a potato. And you don't need to plant an instruction manual when you plant, potatoes saying, okay, Mr. Potato, here's how you grow into a potato, or carrots. There's an innate wisdom in the world we live in and the universe, but this innate wisdom is also in your body. So what I want to point out is that what we as humans do is we let the oldest part of us, meaning the reptilian part of the brain, the basal ganglia, we let the oldest part of us control the highest part of us, which is higher function of the mind. And this is exactly what keeps us into addictions, is that we allow the addictions that hurt us, that kill us, that make us unhappy and everything else, is that we allow these addictions in our life, when they come from the lowest function of our being, to destroy and override the whole of our being. Because our addictions control the wholeness of you, because the wholeness of you is contained within that physical bag that you walk around in, calling you, which is not you. So hopefully you get that, is that if you're in any kind of addiction that's self-destructive or doesn't work for you, it's because you are, and you didn't know till now, but you have been allowing the lower part of you, the lower function of you, to control the higher function, the higher essence, the higher being of you. MIT in 2012, and there's been tons of brain research the last couple of years, but there was something, just one line. I looked at some research a while back, and that one line said, I can't talk today. MIT neuroscientists identify a brain region that can switch between new and old habits. Think about that. Let that soak in. Is because for many years, scientists thought, a habit, you can't choose the habit. And then some more brain research coming back up several years ago, like 2012 at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Germany, demonstrated that yes, your brain does go into habit mode and makes your decisions for you, unknown to your consciousness. What happens is the brain makes your decisions, and then you think about your decisions. But here's what here's what research recognized. Is even though we automatically go into habits, we have the power to consciously start or stop a habit a few seconds before we engage in the habit, which means you have free will and you have choice. People that actually have not done enough research on this will say, that science research shows we have no free will as human beings because the brain makes our decisions for us. And then they'll go into, well, if I have no free will, I can't choose my habits, blah, 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 blah. And what science demonstrates is that your brain does make the habit, but you have the free will to redecide a habit before you go into it a couple of seconds before you engage in the loop of getting into a habit. What does all this mean to you, and why am I sharing all this with you? Is what we want to do is, let's go back to the premise that I gave you, or what I said earlier. You're the highest technology on the planet. We, me, you, all of us, we're the highest technology on the planet. That being said, you have the power to choose what your brain does, before you go into the habit. You have the power to choose. And what we want to choose is we want to choose habits that are our best possible habits. Habits that can actually work for us, habits that can actually serve us and build us and create a happy, healthy life. So this is why, I ask in the introduction, what are your best addictions? Because from this episode, and maybe listening to me before, perhaps reading other things, your brain's going to create habits, and these habits become addictions, and you're going to have, make no mistake, every single person on the planet's going to have addictions. So ask yourself, what addictions would serve me well at this point in time in my life? You can also go back to the last episode on authority and listen to that again, because that's kind of what I'm talking about here, is you were born. It's so funny is that your body and your brains in your body is a finite being. It's a finite structure. It's a finite shell. You were somewhere before you got to the planet, which means you were infinite. And so it's interesting that an infinite energy incarnates into a finite energy and lets the finite energy control the infinite energy. And if you're stuck in habits that are self-destructive, been there, done that, that's exactly what you are allowing and choosing to do. And now you can be thinking, okay, Jim, I get it. I'm on board. What do I do? Well, what you do is you evolve. Is that you have to evolve into higher function of your mind and yourself. And your body is not yourself. Your body is the shell that you're walking around in and living in and existing in. You are that infinite being that travels from body to body to body. And what's important is that we focus, and that's why, without telling you guys, a while back I did an episode on people making money their master. When we attach to things in this 3D world, we literally are bound by that. And we actually shut off our higher awareness and higher function. There's a phrase that Don Javier said to me many years ago. And that phrase is that and meaning men or women or person, but I'm going to use men because that's the way it was said to me. He said, the common man is hooked to other men. The warrior is hooked to infinity. Think about that. Because the spiritual part of you, that energy, that essence, that soul energy, that higher self, that luminous body, it's attached to infinity. So what we have to do is we need to, I'm just telling you what we have to do, speaking for myself, and then take what you want, is we have to let go of our attachments. It doesn't mean that we don't have them in our possession or we enjoy them, but we have to let go of our attachments to the world that we live in, because people literally in the world we live in by media and the Prada bag company and the Rolex company and all these companies and Doritos and all these companies, they want you addicted to their products. Why? Because you buy their products. It's all money. It's all superficial. It's all not soulful. Now, of course, I want you to have these things. I want you to enjoy your life. I want you to be comfortable. But yet, to live your comfort at the expense of the growth of the soulful part of you is not very wise. Think about that. So what many people do is they give up their power to they give it up to the illusion. Many people think the almighty dollar, as an example, is going to give them safety and security. Nothing is going to give you safety and security on this particular planet. You can get smacked by a bus tomorrow. Your plane can crash. You can get a disease. You can get an illness. You can fall off a ledge. There's no security in this lifetime. None. There's no security, but people have this illusion of, if I have money, then I'm going to have security. But that if that were truth, then how come people that are very, very wealthy aren't secure from leaving the planet? There is no security. So people trade the higher function of their being and their self for the lower function, which keeps them in the addictions and keeps them trapped for a lifetime. So they're trading their soul energy for their physical energy, which again is finite. So there's a couple of phrases that I love, and we'll wrap up here to give you guys some guidance here. I love this phrase, and many of you have probably heard the phrase. It's that be in this world, but not of this world. And that's how I strive to that's how I strive to live my life, is that I'm in this world just like you. I mean, I'm doing this podcast. I'm in this world. But many years ago, I used to tie to this world because I thought people would see me as successful if I had the homes and the cars and the money and all that. And you know what? I never had all that stuff many years ago, and I chased it. And I attached to it. And now that I have all that stuff, it means nothing other than a tool of convenience and a tool of joy or fun, or, having a warm place to sleep or a warm shower. But you know what? It doesn't define the essence of me. And some of you guys are wanting, I understand, I've been there. You're wanting practical steps. Okay, Jim, well, how do I move to the higher part of me so I can actually now dominate and manage the addictions in the lower part of me? Maybe a great addiction to have is the addiction into not self-growth, because self-growth for many people is growing the 3D ego and our money and, let me improve my personality and, how to win friends and influence people and all this stuff. Yes, that all helps. But if you want to be addicted to anything, which I tell people, you want to know your purpose, because people always run around, here's your purpose. What's my purpose? What's my purpose? Relative to the 3D ego. If you want to live your purpose, what you do is your purpose is to evolve. Your purpose is to evolve on this planet. That's it. That's it. That is living your purpose. And a Rumi quote that I wrote down a bit ago. The Rumi quote is, and when you get this, it's like whammo upside the head. The Rumi quote is, the universe is not outside of you. Everything you want, you already have. Think about that. The universe is not outside of you. Everything that you want, you already have. Why? Because it was inborn. You look, for example, at a baby that's born. No one has to teach a baby how to smile and how to laugh. Why? Nobody has to teach a baby how to be happy when they're smiling and laughing before they even have the cognition or the cerebral ability to even know what happy is. Why? It's a factory setting, so to speak. When I say factory, you came to the planet with it. It's a factory setting. So, living from your higher self and into that place, it's a factory setting. And most of us erase the setting when we get here, because what happens is the world that our parents and socialization traps us in the world of money and identity and ego and power and greed and security and all these things that, by the way, as I said, to be repetitive, it's great. You want 4 jets? That's fine. Not great for the environment, but that's fine. It's your deal. You want a Ferrari? That's fine. You want a Rolex? That's fine. Don't care. You want a $10 million home? Great. Enjoy it. Enjoy the house. But the reality, do not attach to it and let it define you, because it will distract you from knowing yourself. Because most of us, once we have those things, we define ourselves by those things, yet we are not those things, because we are infinite and those things are finite. Every year on New Year's Eve, my family with Don Javier gathers. And every year he says the same thing to me, one line. He says, I hope you come to know yourself better this year than you did last year. Think about that. I hope you come to know yourself better this year than you did last year. So what's your transformational takeaway? And it's a journey. It's a path. It's not like, snap your fingers, Shazam, here it is, wallapazing, saying, wave the magic wand right in front of you. And it can be. It's a path. I mean, I've been on this path for a lot of years. But and where we want to go is to know yourself. When you know yourself, you can then go back to the very beginning of this podcast. You can consciously choose the best addictions for you. When you know yourself, you can consciously choose the best addictions for you. And then make sure those addictions are addictions that serve you and that build you and help you grow so that you can maintain a state of well-being and you can be a leader and you can assist other people on the planet. Okay, that wraps up this episode. Thank you for listening. Like I said, if you're new here, I appreciate it very, very much. I'm grateful that you're here. Please share. If you find value in these episodes, please share on social media. And go back to the beginning and start listening again. Okay, I'll catch you over on another episode. Bye-bye.